This is not the title of this study, but I just want to give us a reference point connected to a short reading that I want to give to us. Any more pens? Is there another pen? Two streams of information. I'm pretty certain that most of us, if we're not comfortable, we've at least heard of the notion, this idea about two streams of information. And I guess the way most of us are going to understand it or take our reference point at this stage in our experience is with the symbols of CNN and Fox. If I can just use those as like placeholders, because I think that's the reference point that most people understand this idea of two streams of information. For many of us, it's come as a surprise, maybe a shock. It's disconcerting for some of us. But I want to read a passage that I think might be of interest to us in regard to this idea of having two streams of information. I'm not going to give you the reference at the beginning. I'll give you the reference at the end. In fact, I don't want to give you the chapter title either. I want you just to listen to the words, and I'm sure many of you will pick up where I'm reading from, but I'll just confirm that at the end. So I'm going to have to do this backwards, because if I start at the beginning of the chapter, you'll all guess too quickly what we're reading about. So this sort of cuts halfway into the passage. So this is a quote from Testimonies to Ministers, page 112. So it's TM 112. The light that Daniel received from God was especially given for these last days. The visions he saw by the banks of the Ulai and the Hiddekel, the great rivers of Shinar, are now in process of fulfillment, and all the events foretold will soon come to pass. So I'm just reading verbatim. I'm going to not try to paraphrase as much as I can. The visions on the bank of the Ulai is the vision of Daniel chapter 8, and the only part of the vision by the Ulai which had not been fulfilled when Sister White made this statement was Daniel 8:14, which began its fulfillment in 1844. However, it was and still is in process of fulfillment. When the Ulai flows into the sea, it ceases to exist. Likewise, when Christ finishes his work in the most holy place, the message of the everlasting gospel has finalized its course. The vision, which was now in the process of fulfillment, that was given to Daniel by the Hiddekel, is the vision of the last 6 verses of Daniel 11. The only part of Daniel 11 which was as yet unfulfilled when Sister White wrote these words, "When the Hiddekel flows into the sea, it ceases to exist, and when the king of the north comes to his end, and none shall help, the message of Daniel 11 has reached its conclusion." So we have these two rivers which are being portrayed as two streams or two sources of information. One is the Ulai and one is the Hiddekel. One is dealing with the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 8, and one is dealing with the fulfillment of Daniel 11. The two rivers flowing to two symbolic bodies of water, the Ulai to the Sea of Glass, the Hiddekel to the Lake of Fire, two visions presenting both the story of the redeemed and the story of the lost. So we have two rivers, two visions, two stories. As these rivers flow into the sea, their messages cross the boundary line of human probation, forever separating the righteous and the wicked. So you have two rivers, and if we were to go back and read what I just read to you in your hearing, even if the word wasn't explicitly there, it's implied strongly that these two rivers are two sources of information. So one leads to life and one leads to death. One is about God's church, and one is about, I call it the papacy, or Babylon. So one is about Jerusalem, and one is about Babylon. And there are two visions, Vision 1 and Vision 2. We can pick all of that up from these statements that we've read. And when they both reach this body of water, both streams of information have accomplished their work, and I'll read again what it said. As these rivers flow into the sea, their messages cross the boundary line of human probation, forever separating the righteous and the wicked. So if I can just perhaps do it this way, that when you go from the river to the body of water, you've reached the close of probation. So these two rivers bring two classes of people to the close of their probation. And these rivers flow, so we know they're all about information. It says that in the passage, even though the word itself perhaps isn't used. So they're both rivers of information or streams of information that bring you down to the close of probation. Daniel and Revelation complement one another in many areas, including the messages of the two rivers, which are used to identify the last twofold message in the book of Daniel. The rivers find symbolic counterparts in the two rivers of Revelation. There we find the river of life for those who accept the everlasting gospel, which we also, while we also see the dried up the river Euphrates, illustrating the bankruptcy of the worship of Babylon. So again, it talks about the river of life and the river of death. It talks about those who find the river of life and those who are going to be dried up in the river Euphrates. As we partake of the water of life, we are to call those who are drinking the foul waters of the Euphrates to flee from the broken cisterns of fallen Babylon. The book of Daniel contains the final message of warning for this last hour of Earth's history. This final message, symbolized in the visions of the banks of the Hiddekel and Ulai rivers, identify both the false worship of the king of the north and the true worship of the king which is now in the most holy place above. So if I could just rephrase that, these are both stories about the king of the north. In the language that we use currently, this is the true and this is the counterfeit. I'm sure a fair number of you already know where I'm reading from. This is, of course, chapter 1 of the Time of the End magazine, and the title is The Testimony of Two Rivers. And the reason why I wanted to begin this study with this thought is so that we can hopefully have some assurance that what is being taught today, even though it looks unexpectedly different to perhaps what we expected, I think in the Sabbath school, someone was saying it challenges our concepts of what we thought was right and wrong, that this idea of two streams of information is nothing new. They're embedded in the foundational work of this movement when the message was formalized. And I think it would be useful for all of us to perhaps go back, if not to read the whole book, at least to read that first chapter, that introductory chapter, and see how the author uses this model of two streams of information to make the point of where to find eternal life and how to escape eternal death. And my understanding is that when we've spoken about two streams of information, these are symbols, if I can use it in that way, and people have felt challenged, maybe even offended by this idea. I'm suggesting it's nothing new. But what is new is that our ideas of what is right and wrong are being challenged in a way that I think has taken many of us by surprise. And without going to the scriptures on this, if I can bring us back to when Christ goes back to Nazareth and he's asked to present from the pulpit, he opens the book of Isaiah and speaks about those people who are in captivity as opposed to those people who are free. And if I can borrow from this chapter, it's these two groups. Those who are following this stream of captivity or death, and those who are free. And we all know how that story ends. That the people that he's speaking to, what do they believe about themselves? Where do they think they're drinking from? Which stream of information are they following? They're all certain that they're on the right side of this argument. And when he tells them that this prophecy is being fulfilled today in their hearing, even though it sounds benign in the English, what he's actually telling them is that you think you're okay here, but I want to tell you, you're actually in this camp. And I want to offer a suggestion that many of us in this movement, even though we feel, even though we've been told, even though we may have an awareness that we have escaped from Babylon, we have escaped from the Laodicean condition, because we're not the church of Laodicea, we're the church of Ephesus, that in our experience, that work of reformation, that work of repentance hasn't been completed yet. And as we began this movement here in this chapter about two streams of information and the decision that everybody that's confronted with this message has to address for themselves individually. And I believe each of us did that if you are in this movement. for whatever pretext, even if you feel that you're not fully there or you have moral sin in your life, all of us are here for one reason, because we've all read this chapter and we've all appreciated that we want to go down the river of life and not follow this stream of information. And so we have felt secure in that belief, thinking that we've passed the test, if I can express it that way. And the only test that we've got left is the Sunday law test, which I think in many ways, because of the way we've explained and understood our own experience, has been a moot point. That it's just a box ticking exercise. That if we've passed all these tests, for sure we're going to pass the Sunday law test. The people who are going to struggle with that test is everyone that's still here. So when this concept of two streams of information has been presented as, if I can say it, the foundational piece of work that's connected with the Midnight Cry message, people have felt, maybe they felt insulted, or they felt that it was a personal accusation against them, that they haven't believed or understood or haven't really been a genuine member or part of this movement. But I want to suggest that what is actually being identified is part of the work of sanctification. That work has not been completed yet. And many of us who felt that we were secure in our religious beliefs, Daniel 11:40-45, that we were here, I'm not saying that we weren't, but the work of sanctification runs deeper than just the intellectual assent to the truth of the last 6 verses of Daniel 11. They have to impact us at other levels, in other ways. So I thought that was interesting. And as I recommend that each of us go back and read this chapter and see if they too can perceive that this idea of the concept of two streams of information, I'm not suggesting here in this chapter there was a reference back to these two news outlets. I'm not making that connection. I just want us to see the principle of having two streams of information, one that leads to life and one that leads to death, is not a new concept. It's right back there at the beginning of our message. And there's many reasons why I wanted to bring that point up, but one of them is that there is a lot of talk in our movement about disagreements between the leaders, whether it's myself or Elder Jeff or Elder Tabo or Elder Marco, that there seems to be a lack of unity between those who are leading out in this movement. But I think a lot of that is based upon misunderstanding, and without getting into the morality of it and innuendos and things like that. All of us, not only those 4 people that I've mentioned, but every single one of us is being challenged by this same problem that each of us needs to come out of this Laodicean condition. Now, CNN and Fox, again, has both been a blessing and a curse in the explanation of this concept of two streams of information, because people who live in the glorious land have this idea that Fox is only the American news outlet, and how does it affect someone in Egypt or Somalia or Ethiopia or any of these other countries, any country across the world, because are we expecting that they need to go on the internet and watch CNN or Fox News? And I think that's a misconception of what we want to understand about two streams of information. So already, hopefully you can see that when this concept of two streams of information was first brought to the movement back in 1996, there was no idea about CNN and Fox News. I don't think it's a coincidence that Fox News was created the same year. I think many of us can see that connection. But what it hopefully should give us is the ability to see that the idea of two streams of information is bigger and broader than, if I can express it this way, an American problem or a Republican issue about choosing two news outlets. Because if you're not aware, what I understand Fox News to represent is the church. It's not a news outlet. It becomes a symbol of the church. What many of us would think about, we would call apostate Protestantism, or when the church puts its hand out and goes into an alliance with the state. But it doesn't look like that, because it's obviously a media-savvy organisation that people get huge salaries, and it's secular in its, at least in one sense. You know, people have different religious beliefs, but they would claim to be a news media. It's not what we would think the church would look like. So when we start thinking about CNN and Fox News, I want us to, if we haven't already begun to do that or see that, to expand our horizons and not be focused upon just these two news outlets and think it's an American issue and no one else has to deal with this problem. What these are, they become symbols of everything that's wrong with us as human beings. And if we become closer to home, us as Adventists or us in this movement. It's not whether or not you watch CNN or you watch Fox News and the impact that they have upon you. I'm not denying that they do have an impact, but the point I'm making is what my focus on in this conversation is not to go over the logic and the arguments about the rights and wrongs of which news source we should go to, but to see them as symbols of these two rivers, these two streams of information, and how those things impact us at a broader and deeper level. I want us to turn to Daniel 11, verse 40. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. Now obviously this is a passage that all of us are familiar with. Many of us can quote it verbatim. I'm sure you're all aware that we have a particular perspective of how to interpret this verse. It may be explained in different ways. So if you were to go to this document, the Time of the End magazine, this verse is explained by bringing us to the year 1798 and 1989. You're all aware of that. And all we have done, at least some people have done, is to take all the arguments and logic that were used at the foundations of our movement to bring these two dates together and to understand them as being at the time of the end. And the reason why I emphasize at is because Ellen White almost exclusively refers in the context of in the time of the end. She repeatedly talks about we're living in the time of the end. So when we've approached this verse, we've bypassed that spirit prophecy context to talk about in the time of the end, and we have focused exclusively to say this is at the time of the end, as per the verse teaches. When we've done that, I think sometimes we've lost sight that 1989 is not only at the time of the end, but it's in the time of the end. And those of us who were at the study yesterday evening, hopefully you can recall how we discussed the idea that this waymark has two characteristics or properties. One of them is a unique and independent waymark, 1989, but it also has properties and characteristics that it borrows or that are conferred upon it by 1798, if you remember that discussion. So many people now, when we look at this verse and we explain how the verse works, maybe I shouldn't say many of us, I'll say the way I approach this verse, if any of you have seen that, is through a chiasm. So I explain the verse as a chiasm so that we can then identify that when it talks about the king of the south that comes against him, and there's a break in the verse which we call part A and part B, and then the king of the north shall come against him. And the conclusions that were drawn way back at the beginning in this document are the same conclusions. The conclusions haven't changed. It's just the way people explain it. So the way I explain this, I'm sure many of you have seen it, is to see that there is a structural component in this verse whereby you can use William Miller's rules, particularly Rule 1 and 5, to demonstrate that there are only two belligerents in this verse, the king of the north and the king of the south, because this him is the northern king, and this him is the southern king. But the conclusions are the same. The reason why I want to mention that is all of us who believe, and I'm going to say it this way, our version of verse 40 are fully aware of Uriah Smith's version of this same verse. And again, we did discuss this briefly yesterday. And pretty much, I think there's been unity on this point that we have wholeheartedly rejected Uriah Smith's version of verse 40. We just cast it aside out of hand. We said, I think it would be fair to say it's full of error. Maybe we wouldn't use such strong language, but that would be the inference of what we've said. He's using wrong methodology, he's taking words and twisting them, particularly in verse 36, to suit his own agenda or his own end. So as I say, it's all connected to this idea of streams of information, but I just want to move on a little bit as we start talking about Daniel 11 verse 40. So if I can just summarize what I'm saying about verse 40. From the very beginning of our movement, we have understood that verse 40 should be understood or interpreted as a part A and part B, and both of them would be identified by the word at the time of the end, 1798, 1989. There's various ways of explaining that, and this is just one way of doing that. And all of us in this movement, because we are so certain about this, have been forced to look at Uriah Smith's version of this verse and say that it's completely wrong. He comes to incorrect or perhaps even bogus conclusions. But I want to suggest an alternative narrative of that scenario. And I want to base it on this premise. Earlier this year I was in Brazil, and it was nothing to do with the classes that were being taught, but there was a discussion amongst the students about predestination, how predestination works. It was just a private conversation that people were having, and people asked my opinion on predestination. And I said, I don't actually understand how predestination works. But that topic ended up filtering its way into the classes. And it began to challenge me in my understanding of predestination, or what we might say conditional prophecies. Maybe that's a nicer way to express it. How do prophecies become conditional or unconditional? Now, I don't have the answer to any of those questions. And the reason I don't have the answer to that is you can find many Spirit of Prophecy quotes that talk about the possibility and the probability that Christ would have returned long before 1888. And if you've heard presentations that I and others have done, we're now at a place where we predict the date for that. We'd go 25 years before 1888, and we'd predict that the second advent would have been in 1863. Whether or not you agree with that or understand that or accept it, there are strong Spirit of Prophecy quotes that say it was Christ's will that he should have returned ere this. I think that's how she expresses it. And if that's the case, then it impacts our understanding of things. And the reason I say that is because if we were to go to a line, say, of Seven Thunders, and I think many of you have seen how you can connect the Millerite history of Seven Thunders with the history of 7 Persian kings through 2300 days, and then you can connect it and tie it back to 7 Judean kings and 7 Israelite kings. Hopefully we're all familiar with that. I'm focusing now on the 7 Judean kings. It begins with Manasseh and ends with Zedekiah. And if you've seen the way we've done those studies in the past, we've identified, and we haven't made this up, that Manasseh becomes an earnest or a deposit or a sign of what's about to happen. And if you go to his grandson, Manasseh, Ammon, Josiah, by the time Josiah is on the scene, and he speaks to Huldah about a reformation that needs to take place in the church, Huldah says, if I can paraphrase her, says, sure, go ahead and reform, but it won't make any difference because things have gone so far that the destruction of Jerusalem is now inevitable. If you go a little bit before that, you get to the prophet Habakkuk, and Habakkuk is going to have this little play, this little parable between God and his people, and he's going to confirm this even before Josiah is on the scene, that God is about to destroy Jerusalem, and it's inevitable. So, are those prophecies conditional or not? We understand. I understand. I'll say it for myself. I won't speak for others. By the time you get to Manasseh, the end is certain. Jerusalem will be destroyed. But you take that story and you go back to Leviticus 26, and the way it's worded, it says, if you won't change your ways, if you won't change your ways, verse 18, 21. By the time you get to 28, the ifs are taken out because now it's come. But there seems to be this conditionality at one level, but when we teach it through these structures, we see that there is no conditionality. It's inevitable. By the time you get to the time of the end, everything's about to happen. And the reason we know that, or the reason we teach that, is because at the time of the end, the first angel's message arrives and it gives a warning of judgment to come. Whether you're talking about the Millerite history or our history, it's inevitable. So I make those 2 points to state that I don't fully understand how conditional prophecies work. But what I do want to say is, if we take Ellen White at her word, and she says Christ could have returned in the first generation, then how do we deal with Daniel 11 verse 40? Can we approach Daniel 11 verse 40 in this way? And when I mean this way, I don't mean the date per se, because that's not what the point I'm making is. Can we say that verse 40 is a chiasm? Can we say that there should be 2 time of the ends, 2 complete independent reform lines, all contained in the first generation of Adventism? Would we be allowed to do that? And I don't know if you've thought about this before, but I'm suggesting no, we could not have done that. And if we could not have done that, then our approach to verse 40 has to be different than we currently have. We have to have a different approach. I don't mean today, I mean if you go back as a Millerite. You can't approach verse 40 in the way we approach it. So that opens up many thorny issues about applications, about original intent, about methodology, how we approach Scripture. So without going into the intricacies of this, what I'm suggesting is that Uriah Smith's version of verse 40 has merit. And that's to put it mildly. What gave me confidence of that fact is what I didn't initially appreciate is, I think I had this in the back of my mind already, that much of Uriah Smith's work was not his own. And I don't say this as an insult, I just want to make the point that he was a plagiarist. And I don't mean that in the technical sense. All he does is what we do when we go on the internet, we copy and paste. So all he did was just copy and paste other people's work, and I don't mean that in any moral or derogatory sense, because I know many people hold Uriah Smith in high esteem. His book was God's Helping Hand. So please don't get offended by that statement. The reason I make that point is what I want us to know is who he copies his information about verse 40 from, because that to me becomes of interest and relevance. So if you watched this study before, you already know the answer, but some of us may not have. And he gets that information almost verbatim from Josiah Litch. So Uriah Smith's version of verse 40 is Josiah Litch's version of verse 40. And we might argue that, so what? What difference does that make? But I want to suggest that as soon as we start taking it to a Millerite or a pioneer, then we have to start looking more carefully at why they said what they said and the logic and the reason behind what they're doing. So I want to give it, in my estimation, it's become a more important perspective than just Uriah Smith's. Because I was happy to say, I understand the helping hand argument, but who is Uriah Smith? It's just his personal perspective. But now I'm dealing with a Millerite, and not just any Millerite. He's a famous Millerite. And the other thing that I find of interest is when he did or presented this study, it's in 1841. And that becomes of significance to us because it's not just close to 1840, it's actually connected to 1840. So what I've now done, if you're willing to accept it, so I'm saying in my mind, is to go to Daniel 11 verse 40, acknowledge that the Millerites had a perspective of that, if Christ would have returned in their generation, I don't think we would have had 2 times at the end. We would have been saddled with 1. And if we were, we would have struggled to come up with this story here about having 2 people, 2 belligerents. We would end up having 3. The reason why we as a movement find that problematic is because we feel that it's too literal. And we're going to struggle to see, as Litch would do, to see that the king of the north is Turkey. Even though he presents what for many people would be a robust argument as he draws you down from the beginning verses of chapter 11, and he traces the king of the north, and he gets all the way down to Syria/Turkey, and he develops an argument about that. He has a perspective. And most of us would just discount all of his logic because, we'd use, you can't go to literal, it has to be literal, going to spiritual. So we have arguments to counter what he's saying. But what I want us to hopefully consider is if he has a perspective that has relevance for us, and I believe he does, then the way he approaches that passage, which I, and I think other people have done in the past, would identify him as being a newspaper prophet, someone who just consults the newspapers and makes a prophetic application about them, inferring this is something that's completely wrong to do, is to perhaps reevaluate his whole approach to verse 40, or our approach to verse 40, so that you're not perturbed. I'm not saying our approach is wrong. What I am saying is perhaps there's light for us to learn about the Millerite approach. And the reason why, there's a number of reasons why I want us to see that, but one of them is the following, that what they're going to do is look at events that are occurring in the world, and they want to see how those events are impacting the movement, which is the same thing that we do. We do the same thing. For whatever reason, maybe the world is too complicated today. Maybe we're not as diligent. So I don't know where to apportion the blame, but we don't pick up everything that's going on. There are things that are happening before our eyes, and we're not attuned to them in the way that I think that we should be attuned to them. So that was just a segue to come back into this issue about 2 streams of information, that it's much bigger than just CNN and Fox, because we have clues already about the extent of this issue. If you're keeping up with the presentations that are being done, you know that one of the subjects, besides the one that was addressed this morning in the Sabbath School remarks, about the nature of the US government and whether it should have been a secular or a religious entity, I think Jones's position on that, and the way my brother put those extra pieces of information was well stated. We come to our own history, and Ellen White is going to talk about certain things that are going to be fulfilled. One of them is the issue of slavery. So I think all of us accept that at face value, slavery is going to come back into existence. And maybe we've got preconceived ideas of what slavery looks like. I'm sure all of us have. And I'm not saying I have all the answers about what slavery will look like at the end of the world. I think we have some thoughts when you introduce the concept of revolutions into the story about the few oppressing the many, and that being a form of slavery. It's not the only one. There are other forms of subjugation or bondage. But I want to just offer a thought. For a while now, we've taught about institutions. Not in the way that is currently being taught in the Midnight Cry message about the institution of the United States and the institution of the church, or what is now being described as the fifth line. I don't know if everybody has heard that term of the fifth line. It was introduced by another title way back in 2016, but because it wasn't identified that way, we didn't see it. So again, it's something that appears to be new in the movement. And the reason I go back to 2016 is because that's Matthew 13, verses 24 to 31, which is the parable of the wheat and tares. The parable of the wheat and tares really is another testimony to this fifth line, if I can explain it that way. And for those of you who are not familiar with what I mean when I say fifth line, you're familiar with the 144,000, the priests, Levites, and Nethinims. And for a few years now, as a movement, we've struggled because perhaps it's mostly me that has done that. I've agitated the issue of how you get midnight cry, Sunday law, Raphia Panium, Daniel 11 verse 41, how that works, what that actually means. Because you can't tie those waymarks with their symbols to any of those four waymarks. We use them as placements, but we don't use the symbology of those three waymarks, midnight cry, Sunday law, Raphia Panium, Sunday law, in any of those four lines. So we now have what is being called a fifth line, which is not the line of individuals, it's a line of institutions. So that's just an aside. But we've been speaking about the issue of the Sabbath and marriage. The two institutions that God instituted, or the two doctrines that God instituted that in Genesis, in the Garden of Eden, and are going to be restored at the end of the world. So this idea of the restitution or the restoration of these institutions, we've been grappling with in our movement for some time. I'm sure you all know that. So I'm not trying to identify the approach or mistakes that we've made on what those things mean to us. But I think we have, if you go back to 2015, when these issues were being discussed or began to be understood, and we saw some of the laws that were being introduced here in the United States about marriage, we thought what was happening was these two streams of information, if I can say it in that sense, and what we were seeing was something wrong, that it was an indication of the government doing something bad. I'm not sure if we're all on the same page on this today, but I understand what the government was doing there was applying the Constitution in a correct and proper fashion. So I'm not trying to go back and say we made a mistake on that, but what I do want to say is that I believe, that the issue of marriage and what it means has to be understood on different levels. It's not that each of us, in a literal sense, must get our marriages in order, which we should. It's not just the fact that Christ is about to marry his church, Esther and Ahasuerus. It is that, but it's more. There are other nuances about what this restoration of marriage actually means and what it looks like. Also with the Sabbath. So we feel that we understand what the restoration of the Sabbath looks and feels like, but I'm suggesting it's probably bigger, not probably, it is bigger than we first think, which goes back to the question that was asked yesterday evening: how does 2014 become a Sunday law when there's not a law about Sunday? It's all to do with this connection about what does the restoration of these things look like. And without going into the details of this, in fact probably without even explaining them, what I want us to do is do what the Millerites did. They did something that looked crazy and what that we say is wrong. They understood correctly that France had become a force to be reckoned with. What they didn't understand was that France had become the king of the South, obviously. They saw this as this belligerent here, the king of the South, is now going to, him, not the king of the South, him, France, is going to clean up the mess in Europe. That's what its job function was. They got that correct, I think. And the mess that had occurred in Europe was because of what the papacy had done in the 1260. So the clean-up operation that France is going to undertake means to dismantle the church-state relationship that's existed, to bring down the papacy, and to straighten out those European nations. And one of the ones that they needed to do, if we could say it in this sense, one of the last ones was England. England needed to be addressed. And what I'm going to explain now is one of the reasons why I think their explanation of verse 40 has relevance to us. So if I just pause there and tell you what the connection is. Today we understand the concept of spheres of influence. We have the king of the north and the king of the south fighting one against another. And we're now saying that they're not going to invade one another's countries. What they're vying for are spheres of influence. You see that back in the story of the Pyrrhic Wars, in the Second World War. You can see those dynamics. So when we come to the story of France cleaning up Europe, and it's going to try and deal with England, they've got two options. Either they invade England or they go through an alternative option. We all know the failure of both France and Spain for centuries in trying to do a head-on attack on England. That channel seems to just stop them from doing it. It's never worked. So initially, France decreed that Bonaparte was to do a frontal attack upon England and to do away with it. But it wasn't the right time of year for that to happen. So they had to wait. It was the spring when they asked for that to happen. It couldn't happen until the fall. And he said, what shall I do? Sort of twiddling his thumbs. And he went on an adventure. And the adventure was Egypt. So he goes to Egypt, the king of the south. But it's more prophetic than that, because part of the purpose of him going there is going to have an alternative attack upon England. So you need to know a little bit about geography on how this works, and you all know that my mapping abilities are really poor. If this is Africa, and this is the Mediterranean Sea, and this is Europe, and I won't worry about Saudi Arabia, and here is India. If I could do that, England is here. So if England wants to maintain its ties with India, which really is its cash cow in this time period, it's got two options. It either goes right round the Cape, which is a treacherous and long route, or it goes through the Mediterranean and accesses the Indian Ocean through the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal doesn't exist there in that history, but it's the predecessor of the Suez Canal. They had a series of canals, so they hauled stuff with camels and donkeys, and they had canals also. So they're going to go this way you've got the two routes, and this is the preferred route, obviously. So what France wants to do is cut off the supply route for England, which is the cash cow of what's keeping England ticking over. So that's the prophetic reason why France goes to Egypt. It's about spheres of influence. So you see it right in their story, and the Millerites understand why this is happening. So they're doing exactly the same thing that we're doing, these spheres of influence. So I think most of us have an idea of how this fight works. So just coming back to this issue about Sabbath and marriage, in 2014, when we talk about the Sunday law, and people ask, well, there wasn't a law about Sunday, I think we need to broaden our understanding of what Sunday laws look like and how they work. And when I say broaden our horizons, most of us already have done that. We've already factored in many of these concepts already. So again, we did discuss this last night. If I were to take the line of the priests and we begin in 1989, where would we end this line for the priests? We'd end it, depending on what symbol we want to use, with either 2021 or Panium. And I think it's Argos, isn't it, I think? Is that right? Yeah? Yeah? I'll get in trouble if I've got it wrong. But we call this the second Advent, don't we? But we know it's not a second Advent. So we already have factored in that these waymarks, whatever we label them as, whether it's the close of probation or the Sunday law, are not the Sunday law of Daniel 11 verse 41. They have characteristics and properties that are borrowed or are shared with their namesake, but they're not the same waymark themselves. And again, this is nothing new. If you were to go to early writings and see how Ellen White, I'm going to express it this way, deals with the issue of the Sunday law. She never mentions the word Sunday law. If you go from Millerite history to the loud cry, she never uses that phrase, Sunday law. But if you were to go to her explanation of what it was, she uses the term the sins of Babylon. And what are the sins of Babylon that she's referring to in that history? I'm going to argue that it was slavery, which was the cause of the Civil War, and the neglect, particularly of the northern states, in not addressing the slavery issue properly and effectively, which dragged this country into a civil war. And it was a punishment or a scourge that God had brought upon the land. So the sins of Babylon that are being dealt with in early writings do not have the characteristics of what we would classically call the Sunday law. Jump forward 25 years to 1888, and now when you're dealing with the Sunday law, you'd probably have to go to the Great Controversy and start seeing how the history of 1888 is now going to be factored in. And now what are we dealing with? We're dealing with a law that's being passed by Congress, so it seems to be more familiar territory of what we would consider a Sunday law to be. So even in the spirit of prophecy, the way the Sunday law is being addressed is different depending on which history you're referring to, if it's 63 or 88. So it shouldn't be a surprise to us that when we come into our own history, that when we start talking about Sunday laws, that what we're doing is picking different characteristics of a Sunday law when we start talking about different waymarks. So when we have 2014 here, and we have Daniel 11 verse 41, there are characteristics here of this Sunday law that we're going to see fulfilled literally here in 2014, and it's those characteristics that have been identified as the Sunday law. So we've had these misconceptions. Perhaps misconceptions isn't the right way of expressing it. We've had a limited perspective of what the restoration of the Sabbath and marriage are all about. And if I can just say this one thought in closing. If you look at the presidency of Donald Trump and you see how he has struggled to power, if you see, ask yourself, who are the famous people that have been identified in this story? It's obviously Trump himself. And who's the other person? In America, sorry, I should have said that. So it's these three people. And I just want to leave you with this one thought, that if we were to take a page out of the Millerites and just to notice something, and either to see, is this noise, which is a phrase that's being used now, a word that's being used, or is it of significance to what we should be understanding about two streams of information, two concepts, two ideas, the issue of republicanism and, I don't say democracy, so the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, CNN, Fox News, however way you want to describe those. And the problem with it is very easy to describe it in American terms, becomes more problematic to do it in terms of other countries, because those other countries are just not as glorious as your country. So we don't have good visibility of them. You know, if I were to say the Conservative and Labour Party, it wouldn't mean much to 90% of the movement across the world field, because no one understands what that means. So I'm saying that these three things have connected to them three ideas about streams of information. And when I say streams of information, I'm using it in the context of this idea. One leads you to life, one idea, one model, one way of thinking, one worldview, and one brings you to death. So we know that whether you accept this or not, this is what many people say, obviously the many people on this side, is that Donald Trump lies a lot. So I'm not going to put lies here, but I'm going to put conspiracy theories. If that's spelled correctly, I don't know. So he promotes conspiracy theories. And I think, okay, I'll just leave it there. Obama was a black person. He was a person of color. So race becomes an issue. We see that in Donald Trump's presidency about, I don't know if this is the correct phrase, white supremacists. We see all of those things being fermented, and Clinton obviously was a woman. She would have been the first woman president, so there's an issue of gender. All of these 3 points have all got this component of two streams of information, two perspectives, two views of what is right and what is wrong. They're connected to this issue here about what the Sabbath looks like, what the restoration of the institution of marriage looks like, that it's not limited to the church marrying Christ, story of Esther. It's not limited to couples who've got an estranged marriage, that they should really press together. Or, as Christ would say, I came to divide families, and marriages are going to be broken as one of those spouses is going to end up having the impetus brought about by the Holy Spirit to break free from those family ties, which could lead to separation of marriage. It's not limited to those issues. So these three people, we have to ask ourselves, is it a coincidence that the dynamic is addressing the issue of gender, race, and conspiracy theories? And I'm suggesting not. So as you start thinking about the Midnight Cry message, and I know many of us have been enamored or fixated by the date, November the 9th, 2019, as though that is the test. So I want us to all be clear that November the 9th is not the test. It's the day that you sit the test, and as you all know, sitting a test doesn't mean you're going to pass the test. So there's that point I want us to bring up. But the Midnight Cry message really is not a test on time. The test on time was in a different dispensation. It was from 9/11 to 2014. That's where the test of time has come. And that's why when you see last year, when the subject of time was finally came out of the closet, was finally brought out, there was no rejection of the concept. It had been fully accepted from the head to the foot. Admittedly, some people have left the movement. I'm not making that point. But by and large, there was no resistance to that. So I'm saying that's an identifier that our test was not and is not time from 2014 to 2019. Does time play a part? It certainly does. We've now identified 2019, November 9th, and you've all seen the studies on that. What we're being challenged on are different ideas, different concepts, which comes under the title, Streams of Information. And the reason why I want us to see that is because if you go back to the Millerite history, the Millerite history comes in two dispensations. I'm going to call it Miller's dispensation and Snow's, if I can do it that way, the first angel and the second angel. And what people perhaps are not aware of until it's identified to them, that in that first dispensation from 1798 to April 1844, I'll use the phrase midnight cry, there was a midnight cry or a loud cry. There was a cry that was made in that history as well as Snow's history. So when we come to our dispensation and we're dealing with the midnight cry, which is Snow's history, there were components of a cry made before, and that was the one that was dealing with time, I want to suggest. The dispensation that we're in now, time is a component, as it was in Snow's message. He needed to clarify the time for the benefit of God's people. But he was addressing other issues too. And today what we're addressing is two streams of information, and it's not, if I hopefully wouldn't be misunderstood, it's not, I'm going to put just, but I want to say it's not CNN and Fox. It's not that simplistic. It's not that blunt an instrument. It affects everybody across the world, and it's not because we can have access to Fox News as much as CNN. It's not based upon that. It affects each of us at a fundamental level. And if I could simplify it this way as we close, it affects us on our understanding of how prophecy works. It affects us on our understanding of how we deal with race. And it also affects us of how we deal with gender. These things seem pointed and simplistic the way I write them, as most of the things that we do, because they're parables. But they contain a lot of information. There's a lot of sub-levels. There's lots of points that need to be addressed on each one of those things and what they mean and how they work. So I want to leave you with this closing thought, if I can just summarize. Two streams of information is not a new invention. It's not even a new phrase. If we had said two rivers of information, it would have been the identical phrase that we had right at the beginning of our movement. But today a stream is being used, and originally rivers were being used. And I'm saying what's being taught today is the same message that was taught at the beginning of this movement. It has all the same characteristics. It's in fact being explained in the same way. It deals with the same waymarks. They all bring you to the close of probation. Two streams of information was originally introduced into this movement back in October with these two news outlets. That was like the introduction to this whole concept of what it means to have two streams. It doesn't end there. It becomes much more pervasive. It attacks you in many different ways. It's going to start dealing with our concept of the restoration or the restitution of the Sabbath and the marriage doctrine. It deals with our understanding of how we approach waymarks such as Panium being the second advent. We're now living in a time period where we're not being tested on time. That test has gone and the movement has passed that test. People seem to think that there are people in the movement who haven't passed that test. We've passed the test. I don't know anyone who has rejected it, from the leaders, from the head down to the feet. Those, when I say anybody, hopefully you understand what I mean by that. What we're being tested on is this issue of two streams. And if I borrow a page out of the Millerite book, they took things literally. They saw what was happening in the newspapers, and they tried to make a prophetic application of those things. The things that are happening in our history in the United States that affects the whole world is Trump, Obama, and Clinton. And if I can put subcategories there or symbols for them, it's the issue of conspiracies, it's the issue of race, and the issue of gender. And these are the things that we're being tested on, which we have to come to grips with before November the 9th. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we give you praise and thanks for your goodness. I want to ask that our time together during these sacred hours would be a time of unity and sweet fellowship. Lord, each of us now have accepted that we're living in the history of the midnight cry. I want to ask that you would guide us and direct us, that we might all come into a unified position. There is no need that any of us should go down the wrong stream. You want all of us, Father, to be on the right stream, to drink from the river of life. Help us, Father, to hear your voice speaking to us, to go back and look how you've led us step by step to the place where we now are. All these things we ask for in Jesus' name. Amen.